10. The scariest stories people share from their hometowns. Every small town has one. From legends of haunted houses to mythic monsters, who knows, a few of them just may be true. We've all heard a scary urban legend or two. They are what small towns are made of. Whether it be the haunted house on the edge of town or the strange and terrible monster that lurks deep in the woods, these stories, passed down from generation to generation, shift and change with the passage of time, and while they are often based on nothing more than our darkest fears, who knows, maybe a few of them are true. Settle in and get ready to shiver as people from around the world share their most horrifying hometown urban legends. Overtune Bridge. There's an old house to the north of my hometown in Scotland called Overtune House, and the legend goes that walking your dog along the bridge that leads up to the house will cause it to spontaneously leap to its death from the bridge. This is an observable thing that has actually happened at least 50 times. People will refuse to cross the bridge, as there are also people who report feeling suddenly and unexpectedly depressed after crossing. There was even a man who threw his baby son off a bridge in a fit of insanity after claiming his son was the Antichrist. There's an old Scottish myth of a thin place where the afterlife and the physical world are very close together. Overtune Bridge is said to be one of these places, dead children's playground. Back when I lived in Huntsville, my home was 100 yards away from the dead children's playground. During the day, it was just a place parents could drop their kids while they visited buried loved ones, but during the night it was also a huge fog trap due to a giant rock wall around half of it. Supposedly, swings move on their own and you can hear children laughing. We used to go out there at midnight all the time, but apparently, you have to go at the witching hour, which I'm guessing is past my bedtime. The Poinsiana Woman. I live in northern Australia, and everyone growing up in my town knows of the legend of the Poinsiana Woman. A quick Google search will elaborate on the many variations of the story, but the one I grew up to know is that of a woman who was raped by Japanese fishermen who hanged herself from a poinsiana tree when she discovered she was pregnant. She is said to disguise herself as a beautiful woman to entice men, with long dark hair dressed in a white gown, and to be located at our Army Reserve. When I was around 12 and my younger brother was 10, he was in his room and I was in the lounge room on the computer. He had come barreling out of his room screaming, "Can you hear that? Can you hear that?" before dragging me over to the window. There was a faint feminine moan/hum. We could hear it moving from the window we stood at, to the one across the room, and back in a clockwise direction. The wind had picked up with the noise, despite how still the night had been. The sound became so loud that we were on the floor covering our ears, crying. When I've brought it up recently, my brother agrees that it was almost as if the sound had been in our heads. This went on for about 10 minutes before abruptly stopping. No wind, nothing. We found out the next day that our older siblings had been at the Army Reserve that night before they got home, had climbed the concrete pillars to the locked gun turret, and had been taunting the Poinsiana Woman before they left when they heard footsteps, assuming it was security. What creeps me out most is that not long after this happened, I realized that we had a Poinsiana tree outside of that window. Slaughterhouse. I used to live near Statesboro, Georgia for a time, and while my own hometown didn't have its own creepy urban legend, there was a legend about the old abandoned slaughterhouse on the aptly named Slaughterhouse Road. The slaughterhouse had been built sometime in the 20s and worked through the mid-40s before a fire ran through the place, killing a number of the employees. The legend was that the fire had been started by the owner when he found out that his young bride wanted to break off the marriage in favor of her childhood sweetheart. Among the dead were the woman and her presumed sweetheart. The owner himself effectively vanished off the face of the earth after the fire, making the case technically, he'd be long dead now, still open. The building has long stood abandoned, with no power, phone, or access to the very topmost floor. Yet this hasn't prevented phone calls to 911 from cropping up from there, as well as strange sightings of a woman walking aimlessly along the top floor where the offices were, Tinker's Hollow. I grew up in Ohio. There is the legend of Tinker's Hollow. It is said old Mr. Tinker, a miner, haunts the site. He can sometimes be seen riding his horse and buggy, and if you go under the bridge, you can sometimes hear his buggy pass overhead. It is said that you can see his green eyes glowing and he'll lead you to his gold if you talk to him. Mr. Tinker was an alchemist. He made a special non-rusting metal that has never been duplicated. There are tombstones around town that were made with his Tinker's metal. They're pretty neat. Unlike anything you're used to seeing in a graveyard, the Chattawa Monster. I live in Louisiana, so we have quite a few yarns to spin. My personal favorite is the Chattawa Monster in my hometown. The story goes that a circus train was coming along and derailed in Chattawa. Now, aboard this train were a variety of critters, but the most notorious of them was a freak. It was a cross between a man and a beast, yet not quite either, and was terribly ferocious, so naturally, it was kept in a heavy cage in its own rail car. When the train derailed, all the cars went into the woods and killed most of the animals, save for a few monkeys that fled to the woods and this creature. Well, the story goes that you should take a little ride out to the Chattawa Bridge in the dead of the night. You then kill your truck and wait for the 12th strike. At first, it gets eerily quiet, then you'll start to hear the chittering and howling of monkeys. The branches of the trees start to sway and shake, and by the time you cut your truck back on there will stand the Chattawa Monster waiting for his next victim, Changelings. Changelings, it's not a particularly frightening folklore. Human children and women were kidnapped by fairies and replaced with fairy children or dying fairies, but the way people reacted was horrifying. Changelings were usually used to describe otherwise misunderstood or mysterious illnesses, deformities, or conditions. So, a woman has a healthy child who starts showing signs of autism at age 2, it must be a changeling. Which is whatever, but there were ways people thought you could get the changelings to reveal themselves, or even ways to get the fairies to switch the babies back. Some of it was stupid, harmless stuff, like cooking egg shells to confuse and surprise the changeling into speaking. Other ways were a lot worse, like beating the changeling, putting it in the fireplace, and holding it underwater. There are quite a few cases where mothers killed their children because they were convinced they were changelings, drowning them, burning them alive, beating them to death, and so on. And it didn't end until relatively recently. In the late 1800s, 9 people became convinced that a woman was a changeling following a serious bout of pneumonia, including her husband and father. They beat her, threw urine at her, burned her alive, buried her body in a shallow grave, and then reported her missing to the police, saying fairies had taken her. They were only charged with manslaughter because they firmly believed they had killed a changeling, not a woman. Or, at least, that's what they claimed, the White Bride. I live in Worthington, Ohio. In our town, we have the legend of the White Bride. Supposedly, in the late 1800s, a wedding was being held in our town square. Through a series of unfortunate events, a horse and buggy ran wildly across the village green and into the wedding party. The bride was instantly killed. The legend goes that if you go to the village green on the anniversary of the tragedy, you can hear the gallop of horse hooves and the scream of the bridge as she was run down. It's a big thing for the kids in our town to gather on the green on this night and see if they can hear it, the Strangler. We have one in Venezuela called El Silbón, the Whistler, typical of the wetland plains and prairie regions we call llanos. The description is usually of a very emaciated man dressed in cowboy rags, unero, with a wide brim hat that hides his skeletal face. He roams the countryside in patches of bush at night, with drooping shoulders, a downcast stare, and a heavy bag full of bones and half-decomposed remains slung over his back. There are 2 distinctive features, however, that make him particular. He continuously whistles, a high chord progression C-D-E-F-G-A-B-C that goes higher in tune with every note, and he is unnaturally tall and strong, with some accounts describing him as towering over 6 meters in height. His origin is not clear, with some tales stating him as an accursed parricide. But whatever he is, he is feared by lone travelers, especially drunk or unfaithful men that travel through the country. According to legend, his ominous whistle is suddenly heard very loud and close, but the source cannot be identified, and, contrary to logic, when the sound becomes lower and more distant, it indicates his immediate proximity. He will then kill by strangling or by concussion, devour the victims and throw the bones in the bag. Can be seen occasionally waiting over the high walls of haciendas or fincas, and honest prayer should keep him away. Stall Cemetery. I live about 15 miles outside of Stall, Kansas. There's a cemetery there with a church, behind which there is purportedly a staircase that is one of the 7 gateways to hell. The church is old, so it's just stone walls and no roof, but allegedly no rain or snow will fall inside of the church, and if you manage to find the staircase, it descends forever and you can never reach the surface, even if you turn around just moments after beginning your descent. There was a large tree near the church that was supposed to have been used to hang witches once upon a time, but the tree was recently destroyed. There's a rumor that when flying over Kansas several years ago, the Pope refused to fly over Stall. It's a very popular spot for drunk high school kids to go visit on a dare in the middle of the night. Sadly, the walls of the church were knocked down a few years ago as well, but you can still tell where it was in the staircase remains. It's supposed to be difficult to find, and I've never bothered to look very hard for it, but a lot of people insist that there really is a set of stairs descending into the ground. I'm not much for creepy stories usually, but the few times I've visited Stall, I wasn't sorry to leave. It's just a creepy place. Mano Woods. In the northeast United States, there's a story about woods people, or Mano Woods. When you're driving along a road in the woods and catch a glimpse of what looks like a person in the corner of your eye, but when you look directly at it, it's gone, they say you might have encountered a Mano Woods. They are masters of camouflage and can sense when someone is looking at them. They come to a halt, so you can't sense any movement. It's speculated that they wear bark, mud, moss, and grass to blend in. They're supposedly human, but extremely simple-minded and barely verbal. They're very small in stature and avoid contact with civilization mostly. Nobody knows where they live or congregate, but they usually move on if there's too much activity around. They're also peaceful. At night or off in the distance, they will do very simple chores at night. They may sweep a barn floor or stack some wood, but anything more complex is beyond them. They do it in exchange for them not bothering them as they sleep in the barn for the night or for some bread and vegetables left out for them to find. They've never been known to steal or kill animals or livestock.